I had been traveling between cities for work, catching late-night buses to save money on hotels. That night, I arrived at a small, nearly deserted bus station in a town I had never been to before. My next bus wasn't due for another 3 hours, so I had no choice but to wait. The station was old, dimly lit, and eerily quiet, except for the occasional sound of a vending machine humming or a distant car passing outside. A single ticket clerk sat behind a glass window, flipping through a magazine, barely acknowledging my presence. The only other person there was a middle-aged man sitting at the far end of the waiting area, his face hidden behind a hood, staring at nothing in particular. I chose a seat near the entrance, wanting to stay close to the exit in case I needed to step out for fresh air. The fluorescent lights above flickered occasionally. The digital clock on the wall read 11:15 p.m. I pulled out my phone to check for messages, but the signal was weak. I sighed, setting my bag beside me, trying to shake off the growing unease in my chest. Half an hour passed. The man in the hood hadn't moved an inch. The ticket clerk yawned, stood up, and walked to the back room, leaving the front counter unattended. I stared at the station doors, hoping to see more passengers arrive, but the streets outside remained empty. Something about the silence was unnatural, as if the whole town had shut down for the night. I checked the clock again, 11:47 p.m. Time seemed to be dragging. A sharp sound broke the silence. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway leading to the restrooms. I turned my head, expecting to see the ticket clerk returning, but no one appeared. The sound continued, growing louder, but the hallway remained empty. My pulse quickened. Was someone there? I glanced at the hooded man. He still hadn't moved. My grip on my bag tightened as I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just an echo. Then, a door creaked. The restroom door at the end of the hallway slowly swung open. I expected someone to walk out, but no one did. I waited, watching, my body tensed. A moment later, the door closed on its own. I told myself it could be the wind, but the air inside the station was completely still. I stood up, pretending to stretch, trying to see if the ticket clerk had returned. The counter was still empty. The hooded man hadn't reacted to any of this. I hesitated, debating whether to check the restroom or stay put. My instincts screamed at me to stay where I was. A few more minutes passed. Then, suddenly, the hooded man stood up. He moved with an unsettling stiffness, his head still slightly bowed. Without looking at me, he walked toward the hallway, disappearing into the restroom. I shivered, unsure why his movements felt so unnerving. Something about him wasn't right. I checked the time again, 12:10 a.m. My bus was still almost 2 hours away. I couldn't just sit there, doing nothing. I decided to step outside for some air. The cool night breeze felt refreshing, but the streets were emptier than before. No cars, no pedestrians, just the faint hum of distant streetlights. When I turned to look at the station through the glass doors, my stomach dropped. The hooded man was now sitting back in his seat, right where he had been before. But I hadn't seen him walk back. My mind raced. Had I looked away for too long? Or had he never gone to the restroom at all? I swallowed hard, my hands growing clammy. I stepped back inside and took my seat again, keeping my eyes on him. The station remained silent. Then, at exactly 12:30 a.m., the ticket clerk finally returned. He looked at me and frowned. "You're still here?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, confused by his tone.
My bus is at 2 a.m.
He glanced at the hooded man, then back at me. His frown deepened. "You should wait outside," he said quietly. I hesitated.
Why?
He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned in slightly and muttered, "That man, he's been sitting there every night for years, but no bus ever comes for him." My heart pounded. I turned my head slowly toward the hooded man. He was no longer there. The chair was empty. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my bag and rushed outside without a second thought. The ticket clerk followed and locked the doors behind us. "Just wait here," he said. I stood there in the cold, staring at the station. Everything looked the same, yet something felt profoundly wrong. When I finally heard the distant roar of an approaching bus, relief flooded me. As the bus pulled up, I took one last glance inside. The hooded man was sitting back in his chair exactly as before. I didn't hesitate. I boarded the bus and never looked back. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. But I know one thing for sure. I will never step into an empty bus station alone again. Before the next scary story, if you're enjoying this, hit subscribe and like to help us reach 1K loyal community. Got suggestions? Drop them in the comments. And don't forget to share the scares with friends and family. I had been traveling all day for a job interview in another city. The long journey had left me exhausted, and by the time I reached the bus station for my return trip, the place was nearly deserted. The only bus left for the night was scheduled to arrive in an hour. The station was old, with dim yellow lighting that flickered every few seconds. The floors were cracked, the vending machines covered in dust, and the ticket booth appeared abandoned. There were only a handful of people scattered across the waiting area, all sitting in silence. Something about the place felt unsettling, but I told myself it was just the fatigue getting to me. I found a seat near the main entrance and checked my phone. No signal. That was strange. I had full service just minutes ago. A janitor walked past, pushing a mop across the already clean floor. He barely looked up as he worked, his expression blank. I decided to ask him about the bus schedule.
Excuse me, do you know if the last bus is still on time?
I asked. He paused for a moment, then without looking at me, muttered, "Don't miss the last one." His voice was quiet but firm. Then he continued mopping as if I wasn't even there. I sat back down, feeling a chill creep up my spine. I glanced around at the other passengers. A man in a dark coat kept checking his watch. A woman in the corner whispered to herself, and an elderly man stared blankly at the floor. No one spoke. No one made a sound. The only noise came from a buzzing light above me and the occasional hum of a passing car outside. A loud thud suddenly echoed through the station. I flinched, turning toward the sound. It came from a locked storage room at the far end of the waiting area. I expected someone to react, but no one did. The woman continued muttering, the man kept looking at his watch, and the janitor didn't even pause his mopping. It was as if I was the only one who heard it. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. Something wasn't right about this place. My gut told me to leave, but where would I go? The city was unfamiliar, and I had no money for a hotel. I had no choice but to wait. The bus finally arrived. Its headlights cut through the darkness as it pulled up outside. The doors opened, but the driver didn't step out. The passengers, without hesitation, began boarding one by one. No one spoke, no one acknowledged each other. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me that something was wrong. As I debated whether to get on, I caught sight of the janitor. He had stopped mopping and was now looking directly at me. He shook his head ever so slightly, as if warning me. My stomach twisted. I stepped back, letting the others board first. The doors closed as the last passenger entered. I barely saw the driver's face, but in that brief moment, I felt something deeply unsettling. He was looking straight at me, smiling in a way that sent a wave of cold fear through my body. The bus pulled away, disappearing down the road. Just then, another set of headlights appeared in the distance. A second bus. This one looked different, older, worn down, but somehow more real. It pulled up to the station and the driver stepped out, looking around with a frown. "Where's everyone? This station is usually full at this time," he said. I stared at him in shock. Another bus just left. He gave me a puzzled look. "Kid, this is the last bus of the night." My blood ran cold. The first bus, the one that everyone had boarded, shouldn't have been there. I turned back to the station. The janitor was gone. The passengers were gone. The waiting area was completely empty, as if I had been alone the entire time. I got on the real last bus without another word. As we drove away, I glanced back at the station one final time. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows over the empty benches. And then, just before we turned the corner, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Standing near the locked storage room was the so-called janitor. He wasn't holding a mop anymore. He was just standing there, staring at me. And beside him, barely visible in the dim light, were the passengers who had boarded the first bus. None of them moved. None of them blinked. I turned away, my heart pounding. I never went back to that city again. I didn't want to know where that first bus had gone. And I didn't want to know what would have happened if I had gotten on. I had been sitting at the deserted bus station for nearly an hour, shifting uncomfortably on the cold metal bench. It was nearly midnight, and I had missed the last bus home. The next one wouldn't arrive until early morning, leaving me stuck in this old rundown station. The cracked floors, dim lighting, and dust-covered ticket booth made the place feel abandoned. The air smelled faintly of damp concrete, and the occasional flicker of the fluorescent lights above only added to the eerie atmosphere. There was only one other person at the station, an old man sitting at the far end of the bench. He hadn't moved since I arrived. His posture was stiff, his hands resting on his lap and his gaze fixed straight ahead. Something about him unsettled me, though I couldn't quite explain why. At first, I tried to ignore him, focusing on my phone, but my battery was draining fast, and the weak signal made it almost useless. Every now and then I found myself glancing at the old man, hoping he would do something, shuffle, cough, adjust his position, anything that would confirm he was just another stranded passenger like me. But he didn't move, not once. The silence in the station was thick, almost unnatural, the usual sounds one would expect. I swallowed hard and shifted my gaze back to my phone, pretending I wasn't bothered. After another few minutes of tense waiting, I decided to stretch my legs. Standing up, I walked to the edge of the platform and looked out into the empty road. The street was completely deserted. Beyond the dim glow of the streetlights, darkness stretched endlessly in both directions. It was unsettling, knowing I was so isolated. Just as I turned back, the station's old speakers crackled to life, blasting a short burst of static before cutting out again. The sudden noise in the otherwise silent station made my skin crawl. I glanced at the ticket booth, wondering if someone had turned the system on, but it remained as empty as before. The lights inside flickered, but there was no sign of movement. I turned to check on the old man. He was gone. My breath caught in my throat. There was no way he could have left without me noticing. The station was small, with no back exit, no nearby buildings, just an open road stretching into nothingness. I stepped toward the bench where he had been sitting, my stomach twisting into knots. Then I heard it, a whisper. It was soft, barely audible, like someone standing right behind me, breathing words I couldn't quite understand. No one was there. The air felt heavier now, pressing against my chest. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. Maybe my exhaustion was playing tricks on me. Maybe the old man had simply walked away when I wasn't looking. But something about it didn't feel right. My pulse quickened as I took slow, cautious steps back toward the bench. Then I saw them. Footprints. A single trail of footprints in the dust-covered floor leading from the bench, straight to where I was standing. My breathing grew uneven as I traced them with my eyes. There were no returning prints. Whoever had walked here hadn't walked back. I grabbed my backpack and slung it over my shoulder, every instinct in my body screaming at me to leave. As I turned toward the exit, a sudden gust of wind rushed through the station, slamming the ticket booth's open window shut with a loud bang. I jumped, my nerves on edge. The lights flickered again, and for a brief second, the entire station was plunged into darkness. When they came back on, my eyes darted to the bench. Something was there. A small tattered notebook sat open on the seat where the old man had been. My heart pounded as I hesitantly stepped closer. The pages were yellowed, the edges curled as if it had been left in the station for years. But the last page had fresh handwriting. I leaned in to read. "You should have left sooner." My hands trembled as I stepped away. The silence around me felt suffocating now, thick with something unseen, something watching. I couldn't stay here. Then in the distance I saw them, headlights, a bus. Relief surged through me as I rushed to the edge of the platform, waving desperately. The vehicle screeched to a stop and the doors hissed open. The driver frowned as he looked me over. "You okay, kid? You look like you've seen a ghost." I turned back toward the station. The lights inside flickered once more before shutting off completely, leaving the entire platform in darkness. The notebook on the bench was gone. Without another word, I stepped onto the bus, my legs weak beneath me. As we pulled away, I kept my eyes on the station until it disappeared into the distance, swallowed by the night. I never took the late-night bus again.